Hi everyone, welcome to worship. I don't really have any announcements today, so let's just start out with the Lord's Prayer. Will you please join me? Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. For thine is the kingdom, the power, and the glory forever. Amen. And now, if you would, please join me in celebrating our September birthdays and anniversaries. And please ignore my horrible singing voice. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday, dear Tom and Kenny and Bob and Grayson and Leanne and Ron and Tom and Sonny and Kyle and Bruce and Chris and Vince and Jeff and Lily. Happy birthday to you. And if you're one of those people, if you want, you can pretend to blow it out right now. 3, 2, 1. Also, a happy anniversary to Catherine and Frank Gordy, and also to Karen and Bill Hughes. Sorry about that. Did not realize we were starting. Okay. Do you know what this is? Do you know what it's used for? Well, it's a screwdriver, and it's used for screwing in screws and unscrewing screws. And it's not just that, but it's a flathead screwdriver. So it's used for screwing in flathead screws and unscrewing flathead screws. Now, has anyone here ever tried to use a flathead screwdriver on a Phillips head screw? I've done it before, and I can typically get it to work, but it usually takes more effort, and sometimes it strips the screw a little. Or have you ever tried to use a screwdriver for something other than screwing and unscrewing screws? I think I've tried to use it as a tiny pry bar before. Or one time, I remember trying to use it to break through some kind of piece of wood. And so I took a hammer, and I made a mini wedge and sledgehammer out of it. And that didn't work too well, though. So then I grabbed some nails, and I hammered in a line of nails into the wood until I could snap it in half. Because that's what a hammer and nails are meant to do, right? They're meant to break things in half. And speaking of hammers, this past week, I was listening to a podcast, and I heard this story. So this man, he has two sons, two young boys, and one day they found his tools, and they wanted to play with them. So they grabbed two hammers, and they went out back and started using them as pickaxes, right, or shovels. And so they're in the back, and they're using the backside to dig up the dirt. And it wasn't super effective. It wasn't the best shovel. But then this dad, well, he showed his oldest son what the back of the hammer was for pulling out nails, right? And suddenly his eyes lit up, because now this not-so-great shovel, it finally made sense to him. And then he was so excited to learn what it was for that he kept asking his dad to pound in nails so that he could pull them out. Moral of the story, tools are designed for specific purposes. They work best when we use them the way they are intended to be used. So cool, right? That's our basic life lesson for the day. It has nothing to do with the rest of this sermon. I thought everyone should probably know that about hammers and screwdrivers and the misuse of tools. But let's move on to our spiritual lesson of the day. So we're still talking about the law. Now, some of us have probably been told countless times that we are not saved by keeping the law. And if we are not saved by keeping it, then what reason do we have left to even try to obey it? Right? What good could come from following God's laws today? And we might be wondering, why are these even in our Bible? Am I supposed to follow all of them? Just some of them? What are these laws for? What do I do with them? So here we go. I believe the law is a tool. So as I said last week, the law is part of God's plan to deal with sin. Part of God's solution to the death and destruction and suffering and brokenness that we bring about in this world. Part of God's rescue mission to save us from ourselves and this hell on earth that we have created. So God, he needs to heal and fix this world. He needs to make it whole. But also God needs us to stop breaking it. And the law, well, it doesn't have the power on its own to fix this problem of sin. So it cannot and could never be the solution. But it is part of the solution. It's a tool for putting the world back together. And God has handed us this tool because he wants us to partner with him. So that's actually why we humans were created, right? We were not created solely to worship God, and we definitely were not created to be God's slaves. We were created to join God in the act of ruling and reigning over and creating good, right? We create good tools like screwdrivers and hammers, and we use these tools to create good things like homes and chairs and refrigerators. And all humans were created for this, but all humans have had a hand in breaking this good creation. And so God, he sets out on this rescue mission to rescue all of creation including we who broke it. And once again, God asks for people to partner with him in this mission. As Christians, right, we partner to reveal God and join him in putting this world back together, one nail and screw at a time. And so this law, this is one of our tools. So a few questions to ponder. Are we using it? Are we using the law? Are we using it wrong? Right? Are we using it like a pickaxe or a shovel? And how should we use it? Okay, so we all pretty much know what laws are, right? Laws are those rules that we create and then agree on and say, this is how we're going to live together. And in our Bible, a law is a command that God gave to the people of ancient Israel. And we might think of the law as all of these laws taken together. That's the law. And so maybe some of us, we have this image of the law as these divine golden tablets just dropped out of heaven that tell humans what to do so they can go to heaven after they die. But is this accurate? Well, the ancient biblical word that we translate law is actually the word Torah. What does Torah mean? Well, it can mean law, but it also means teaching, instruction, principle, guidance. It means way, as in God's way. And Torah is actually the name given to the first 5 books of our Bible: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. And these first 5 books, the Torah, they are filled with laws, but they are also filled with stories. And actually the Torah is most accurately described as a story, because that's how it presents itself. Not as a law book or a law code, but as a storybook. But to be honest, the story can be a bit confusing. So Genesis, it's 50 chapters of action and adventure, plus a few genealogies. But then Exodus, it has its own blazing narrative going from there. But then once we get out of Egypt and we get into the wilderness and we wind up at Mount Sinai, and suddenly there's a shift, right? The thrilling story grinds to a halt, and ancient law code starts popping up everywhere. And it is misleading and confusing, because it might lead us to think that those first 5 books of the Bible are a law book or a law code. And then their purpose is to teach us to obey the laws. But is that accurate? Right? Is the Torah just a law book? What about those 69 chapters of story we get and read before we even get to any of the laws? Does the story play a role in the purpose of the law? Let's hit the reset button. Let's jump back to our earlier question. So maybe the Torah is primarily a story, but what about all those laws, right? Were all these laws given to tell all humans what to do? Well, if they were intended for all humans, why were they given only to ancient Israel? I mean, if you were God and you were trying to give humans clear instructions for exactly how to live, why would you only give those instructions to one nation in one part of the world at one time in history? Right? Wouldn't it make sense to give it to all the nations, all the peoples, for all the time? And wouldn't it make sense to give them in all the languages? Right? Not just Hebrew, but English and French and Spanish. But instead, we've only heard of it being given to ancient Israel in ancient Hebrew. And not to Israel for all time, but given to Israel at that time in their history. Right? Given to Israel while they still had a tabernacle or a temple. And given to Israel before the invention of the printing press and indoor plumbing and cars, before any of that. So if the law isn't telling us today what to do, what is it telling us? Well, these laws, they illustrate the official terms of the covenant relationship between God and the people of ancient Israel. Now, a covenant, it's a formal relationship or a partnership. And these laws were given as part of the covenant terms, so governing the relationship between God and his people. So these laws, they show us what life was like under that covenant, and how God's laws were supposed to affect all areas of their lives, right? Because the laws, they're part of a story about a relationship. And as we read these laws, we read them as outsiders. Because we weren't there when the covenant was made, and we never came along and signed on to it. And yet these laws are for us. They're used as Torah, as teaching and instruction for us. They teach and reveal to us more about God and ourselves and the human condition. Now let's hit the reset button again. Okay, so these laws, right? The laws that we read in the Torah, well, these were intended to tell ancient Israel exactly how to live, right? Let's do a quick thought exercise. So if you were God, what is one rule or law that you would make for us today? So let's say maybe you like some of those 10 commandments. In particular, you like the one about lying. So as God, you might say, no lying. Thou shalt not lie. Ah, great rule. I like it. But I have a question. Does that go for every situation? Or like, what about surprise birthday parties? Can I lie about that? And then as God, you might say, okay, fine, you can lie when you're trying to give someone a surprise birthday party. Ah, thanks, God. But what about with kids, right? Like, there's some times where I think it would be okay to lie to my kids, such as around certain holidays, or maybe things that they might overhear on the news, and then they ask about it, and I just don't think they're old enough yet. Can I lie then? And as God, you might sit back and think, and you're like, okay, fine, you can lie then. But at the same time, you don't want people lying to their kids about everything. So rather than writing no lying except to children, you might make 10 or 20 more laws about exactly when you can lie to them. And then, of course, there are other situations. What if someone asks about how I think they look? Or what if they ask if I like their bedazzled, outlandish cowboy boots? Right? Pretty much, can I lie to protect someone's feelings? Or what if I'm trying to protect someone else from physical harm? Right? Like in Nazi Germany, people lied to try to protect their Jewish neighbors and friends. And it seems like it would be wrong to not lie there. And so as God, you add even more rules and laws. And then, of course, you have to add rules and laws about the punishments for lying when lying is not allowed. Right? And you might have different degrees of consequences based on how bad a particular instance of lying is. Now, after all that, who knows how many rules and laws we have? 50, 100, more? And at this point, we've only dealt with lying. Right? What about murder and stealing and property laws and building codes and labor laws? Now, how many laws do you think are in the Torah, in the first 5 books of the Bible? Well, according to Rabbinical Judaism, the agreed upon number is 613. 613, that's it. Right? When you're reading it, it seems like a lot. But then when you stop and you really think about it, it's like, why so few? Well, in Hebrew, their alphabet is also their number system. And so the 4 letters that spell Torah, if you take their numerical value and add it up, well, you get 611. And so many rabbis throughout history have claimed that if you count up the laws in Torah, you get 613. But the first 2 of those are not counted because the Israelites heard them directly from the mouth of God. And thus, you get 611 laws from Moses. And the Torah equals 611. So these are not all the laws that Israel had. These are just a collection of the laws, selected in part to match the numerical value of their capsule. But admittedly, that's getting a bit into the weeds. Sorry. Let's hit the reset button again and regroup. Okay. So, these are not all the laws? Or did Israel only have these laws that we read about? Well, it's a safe assumption that Israel had way more laws and covenant terms than this. Right? They almost surely had some kind of religious, political, legal constitution that governed their life as a people. So what we have in the Torah, then, is a selection from that Constitution, right? But speaking of that Constitution, right, it's probably different from what we assume, different from what we're used to. Because yes, it was meant to be obeyed, but not necessarily word for word. See, Israel and the other ancient nations surrounding them, well, they were what's known as common law societies. And this is something I just learned from the BibleProject. And you can go look it up and learn more if you want, but here are the basics. So in a common law society, the purpose of law codes were not to be the final word or statement where authority is in the words as written. Instead, they were the start of the discernment process, the start of the conversation. So the laws, along with stories and other pieces of literature, they were things to help you discern wisdom, right? They were examples of how kings and judges applied their ideals of justice and fairness in their society. They were representative decisions from their culture, compiled to train the moral instincts of leaders and judges. So when a judge had to make a decision, he or she would not say, well, this law says da-da-da-da-da, therefore da-da-da-da-da. No, instead, the judge would determine their ruling by looking at this law, and also that story, and this proverb, and that accepted norm, because the laws needed to vary from place to place, situation to situation, right? Lying was appropriate in this situation, but lying was inappropriate in this situation. And therefore here is the punishment that I deem to be appropriate. And so this is what we see with King Solomon and his famous wise judgment. Right? Two women, they came to him, both claiming that a baby was theirs. And Solomon ruled that the baby would be cut in two. And each woman would get half. And one woman was like, cool, sounds good. But then the true mother said, no, let him live, she can have him. And as it turned out, Solomon was lying, right? Now, he had no plans to cut the baby in half, but through this lie, he figured out who the real mother was. So Solomon, he did not consult the law or the Ten Commandments. He used his wise judgment to come up with an appropriate solution and ruling. Because that's how common law works. The law code or constitution was not the final word on what or how the law should be applied. Instead, the laws modeled justice, and they created wise people. And remember, these are God's laws, and so they're shaping Israel to be a nation that looks like God, right? A people that represent God and God's wisdom and ways and justice and mercy and love to the other nations. Through Israel, God's covenant partners, God would be revealed to these other nations, and God would work with and through Israel to start putting this world back together. And the reality is, these laws still have the ability to do just that, to turn us into representatives of God and his wisdom. Right? We have to drill down and find wise principles behind each law. And then we have to pull application out of that wisdom. Because that's exactly what Jesus did, right? He said, you have heard that it was said, you shall not murder. But I tell you, don't be angry. Don't hate. Because that's the wisdom principle behind the law. Or you have heard it said, you shall not commit adultery. But I tell you, don't lust. Don't fantasize. Right? You take that wisdom principle and you apply it. Now, as the BibleProject says, though times and customs change, God's law serves as a bedrock of guiding ideals to help the people of God, both then and now, live in such a way as to love God and neighbor, to live according to God's wisdom and ways. And so if we read the law in this way, as a source of divine wisdom, then it becomes infinitely more valuable to us than laws that are just telling us what to do. Because there could never be enough laws written to anticipate every situation you're going to be in. But the point is not to do that. The point is to create people who are wise, who can know what God's will is. So, if you want to start using this tool that we call the law correctly, well, this is a good place to start, right? It is a story filled with laws, and both the story and the laws contain God's wisdom. Wisdom that God is trying to pass on to us. And this tool when used appropriately, well, it can actually teach us how to properly use other tools. Because if we listen to its wisdom, we will know how to properly use a knife, right? A knife is for cutting apple slices or spreading butter on bread, not for stabbing. Or if you're given gasoline, you know that you're not supposed to use it to build a bomb or burn down a building. You're supposed to use it to take your family on vacation. And this hammer and this screwdriver, right? They are tools for building and fixing and creating, not hurting. And the law even teaches us how to use itself, right? The law is not to be used for tearing down, destroying, harming. The Torah is to be used for building up, for fixing, for healing, for revealing God to the nations, and for putting this world back together, one nail and screw at a time. The law is one of our tools. So, a few questions to ponder. Are we using it? Are we using it wrong? Are we using it like a pickaxe or a shovel? And how should we use it?
He leadeth me, O blessed thought, O words with heavenly comfort brought.
If the Bible is something like divine golden tablets dropped out of heaven that tells humans what to do so that they can go to heaven after they die, then oh my, the Bible just does a really poor job at being that kind of document. I mean, it was given only to Israel, not the whole world. It was given only in their language. Right? Who here knows Hebrew? It doesn't even include all the laws. And it was given to a nation, a people, who were used to these law codes that weren't supposed to be followed word for word. What a terrible plan! If that even was the plan. Right? But as Rabbi David Fohrman points out, he says, Judaism has always insisted that the Torah wasn't written to be merely a law code or a history book. Instead, the Torah is meant to be a guidebook. That is what the name Torah implies. It teaches, it guides. Sometimes the Torah guides by telling us laws. Sometimes it guides by telling us stories about our past. The stories are relevant not just because they once happened. They are relevant because, like law, they can help shape us into our best possible selves. Or as the author Dallas Willard says, he says, the law is not for making us humanly acceptable, but it is still important because the law is good, right? It is right for human life. The law of God marks the movements of God's kingdom, of his own actions, and of how that kingdom works. And when we keep the law, right, not necessarily word for word, but those underlying ideals and principles, when we keep those, we step into God's ways and drink in his power. And Jesus shows us those ways even more fully and leads us into them. But we'll get to that another day. For now, may you go forth with a hungering for God's wisdom. May you search for it in God's laws, and may you find it. May God grant it to you, and may you use it for good. May you partner with God to reveal him to the world, and to put this world back together, one nail and screw at a time. Amen.
Letting go of every single dream, I lay each one down at your feet. Every moment of my wandering never changes what you see. I tried when you spoke, I confess. My hands are weary, need your rest. Mighty warrior, king of the fight. No matter what I face, you're by my side.
When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers, as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you.
Truth is, you know what tomorrow brings. There's not a day ahead you have not seen. So in all things, be my life and breath. I want what you want, Lord, and nothing else.
When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers, as I cry out to you, I will trust, I will trust, I will trust in you. I will trust in you.
You are my strength and comfort. You are my steady hand. You are my firm foundation. The work on which I stand.
Your ways are always higher, your plans are always good. There's not a place where I'll go you've not already stood. When you don't move the mountains, I'm needing you to move. When you don't part the waters, I wish I could walk through. When you don't give the answers as I cry to you, I will trust